of the partnership and sort of the benefits that we see will hopefully accrue from that. And then I'll hand over to my colleague, Ben Rogers. So, London Research and Policy Partnership, LRAP for short, was launched in July last year, and its principal aim is to bring together sort of policymakers and London government. So that, and we're using that in the widest sense of the word. So including GLA, obviously, London councils and the boroughs and sub-regional partners. To bring together policymakers in London government and academic research community in London to work together and so to collaborate together for a better London. And whilst we know that boroughs already have existing relationships with universities, and we ourselves obviously do that as well. I think the tendency has been that those relationships are usually on a sort of project by project basis, or through sort of commissioned research. And the sort of example where there's an ongoing relationship between a sort of borough and HEI is relatively sort of rare. And I think what we want to try and do with LRAP is to create a long-term sustainable relationship between these two important sectors. In terms of the sort of lead partners who've come together to form LRAP, it's the GLA, London councils, the University of London, and the Capabilities in Academic Policy Research, so CAPE for short, and that's a national initiative funded by Research England, which basically aims to bring together policymakers and researchers and have that really sort of important sort of cross-fertilisation. And they also fund policy fellows, both policy fellows into universities and then reverse policy fellows, i.e. Policymakers into universities and academics into policy organisations. So the context for LRAP really, or the partnership, finds its context from the growing movement within HEIs to become more rooted sort of civic organisations or civic anchor institutions, and to be much better connected to their communities and their locality. And but also, so that's a sort of key driver from the university side. From the GLA side, I think it stems certainly from the last from this mayoral administration. It's definitely been around opening up City Hall policy making and putting London as at the heart of that. And that's not necessarily always been the way in which the GLA has worked. So it's really about opening up the policy arena and moving towards co-production as opposed to almost like policies being made in a bit of a black box. Obviously, we see a number of benefits from the partnership. Obviously, we're very fortunate in that we, in London, we have, 40 or more higher education institutions and research institutions, employing thousands of researchers. So we've really got that sort of depth and breadth of expertise which we can tap into. And so from policy, from a policymaker's point of view, it really is a no-brainer, and we should really be making use of that expertise. From a sort of university perspective, obviously the opportunity to work on real life policy problems, I think, is something that they are interested in. So next slide, please, Ben. But obviously what we're aware of is, both sectors. So London government is a very complicated, organism, if you want to put it that way. And the university sector itself, obviously, with 40 odd institutions, itself is complex, and both those sectors have different organisational imperatives. So I think what we see is the partnership is an opportunity to try and cut through some of that complexity. In terms of both research and policy worlds, and to sort of help universities mobilise research, which is going to be very much focused around sort of London regional policy priorities. So that's the sort of key goal. And I'll just hand over to Ben now, who can tell you more about the partnership and its structure and aspirations and ways of working. Next slide, please.
Hi there. Yes, so I'm Ben Rogers, and I'm a professor of practice at the University of London, leading on this work, and I'm also Bloomberg Fellow at LSE Cities, working on European cities. And just I think one thing I'd quickly add to what Michelle's very helpfully said is in terms of the incentives and interest from the university side is actually sort of growing pressure and expectation, including from academic funders around policy engagement, public engagement, policy research partnerships. I mean, there's a real there's increasing amount of sort of funding going into this area. Moving away from sort of perhaps slightly sort of hackneyed ivory tower understanding of research and the role of academic researchers to a much bigger emphasis on the importance of knowledge exchange and policy engagement. So that is the sort of broader national context. As Michelle has already said, the sort of we want to be a really inclusive and well-networked organisation. But there are sort of 4 key partners, which is University of London. We're lucky to have in our Vice Chancellor, Wendy Thompson, somebody who has worked at the GLC in the old days, at the Cabinet Office, has been Chief Executive of the London Borough of Newham. So sort of, there's just an academic leader comes with a sort of real commitment and understanding of London government and interest in London. Then CAPE and its London partner UCL, London councils, and the Mayor for London. Next slide, please. Here we just sort of indicated, and this is a rather crowded slide, sort of some of the ways that we might work. So on the left-hand side, we've been thinking very broadly in sort of 3 types of service that we might provide. The first is sort of brokerage, and that's just really networking, connecting, matching academic researchers and policymakers, so that if you're a policy officer in a borough and you're worrying about an issue and you want to find an academic who might be an expert on it or might be able to support you in some way, you'll be able to go to our sort of brokerage service. Then there's the other end, what we're calling sort of joint research and innovation projects, which is where we, working with the universities and London government, identify sort of absolute strategic priorities that we want the partnership to address, whatever it is, climate change or leveling up or crime, and where we will jointly sort of fund and run and potentially a major research and innovation project. And somewhere in between that, I think, is sponsorship, where we're helping perhaps to sort of bring together an alliance of sort of boroughs and other policymakers and researchers, perhaps help them get a bit of funding, provide some oversight and support, but where we're not the sort of the principal leads, as it were. So that's how we're thinking about it. On the right-hand side, I mean, there's just a number of different things that we are interested in doing. So some I've mentioned already are just about brokering, connecting, whether through sort of digital platforms or through more old-fashioned, wine and cheese events, so that's still allowed, or whatever it is. Calls for research and expertise to fill policy knowledge gaps. This is a sort of growing practice, and I think particularly at the national level, where you've got Parliament and departments putting out calls for gaps in evidence that they would like to see filled. Michelle's already mentioned sort of placements for policymakers in universities and the other way around. I mean, there's definitely, I think, opportunities to do more of that in London. And I mean, we haven't perhaps mentioned this before, but we think potentially there's some quite big prizes here, and just in terms of funding for some of this work. It'll take us a bit of time to get there, but there's definitely opportunities. I think we get this right to apply for some sort of sizable, UK Innovate or academic research funding for some sort of big, perhaps more experimental, more innovative, more ambitious projects in London. And I think just my final point is, I think Michelle and I and the whole partnership, we're very interested in making sure that policy in London is evidence-based, and we want to connect researchers and policymakers for that reason. But I think we're also really interested in going beyond just providing evidence to facilitating, experimentation and innovation, and not just between universities or, and policymakers, but citizens, communities of interest, businesses, whoever it is. Next slide, please. In terms of the structure, so sort of three main organizations. There's the board, the forum, and the executive group. Next slide. And so the board is chaired by Wendy Thompson, and it's got all the sort of important people that you'd expect to see. So we've got Alison from London Councils. Well, I mean, it's all here. Richard Watts, who you'll know, former leader of Islington. Sarah Chater representing Kate, and Niran, who is Executive Director for Strategy and Communications at the GLA, and Philippa, who looks after London Civic Universities Network. So they are the board, and then we have the forum, which we just had its first meeting last month, and that's meant to be a more sort of inclusive organisation which brings together universities, different bits of London government, along with other stakeholders, including sort of innovation agencies like Nesta and Connected Places Catapult, and London civil society and research organisations, Trust for London, Centre for London, London First, and charities like London Funders and the London Plus, which is the sort of hub for London sort of community and civic charities. And that's going to meet 3 times a year, and it'll be an opportunity to really sort of look at best practice, discuss what the priorities should be for the partnership, provide a bit of sort of support and oversight on how the partnership is developing, and we'll be calling in sort of guest speakers and guest attendees, depending on what's on the agenda. Next slide, please. And then there's the sort of rogues gallery here. There's me, Michelle, Ben Cook, Michelle's colleague at the GLA. I'm recruiting somebody to work alongside me at University of London. And then we've got the 2 CAPE research fellows who will be starting at the end of, I always get this wrong, but I think at the end of this month, each of them working half-time. And I think one thing that we'll be particularly charging them with is thinking about brokerage and how we can really, make sure that we're providing something which is useful to people like all the people present on this call today. Next slide. Michelle, is this over to you, or am I still doing this one?
No, you're doing this one.
Sorry. So far we've done one substantial project, which was 2 half-day sort of conferences on levelling up. We put out a call for academics to sort of submit papers they'd like to present. We made a short list of those, and we brought those together with policymakers and others. I think what was sort of, this was before the white paper had come out, and was used by the GLA and London councils to put out a sort of statement and submit papers to central government. Next.
Thanks very much, Ben. Over to me again. So yeah, we just wanted to give you a sort of flavour of some of the sort of scoping work we're doing to help inform the partnerships work programme. So we GLA and London Councils commissioned a small piece of sort of mapping work really to identify and understand how boroughs are currently engaging with higher education institutions and identifying what lessons, what works from that engagement, which we can then sort of build into the partnership. What we also wanted to do was to try and understand what boroughs' sort of strategic priorities were and are, and also where there are evidence and practice gaps, where academic support could add value, both in terms of sort of policy development and service delivery. So we were looking at those both over the short, medium and long term, in terms of the 4 sort of all the 3 areas that Ben has identified. I think what we as a partnership which is relatively young, I think we're really conscious of the need to demonstrate value quite quickly, just to build that confidence amongst stakeholders. And so what we've also committed to in terms of how the partnership operates is very much about, yes, it's about talking and high level discussion and really rich policy and research discourse, but it's also about what can we actually do, what can we practically do where can we practically make a difference in supporting, borough colleagues and colleagues, across London government and elsewhere. So we undertook this small bit of mapping work, and then we held a borough workshop yesterday, which was very productive, and that will help inform the work. Next slide, please. So in terms of the sort of this research, we had contributions from over 16 boroughs, and some of the key areas of research that they identified included sort of, again, I think, stemming from the sort of awareness of the disproportionality, in the way in which COVID has disproportionately impacted different communities, different demographics. So there was a lot of interest around inequalities analysis and metrics. Again, on the back of COVID, looking at how we can sort of, restart the economy, strengthen local economies, strengthen high streets, etc. Understandably, a big focus around net zero climate action, and how do we actually transition to that, to net zero, and how do we do that in a just way? We've already talked about disproportionate impact studies. Big interest in data sharing, and what more we could do in that space. How can we use data as a public good? Again, interest in upskilling the workforce, reskilling the workforce, and digital innovations and smart cities. I think that what we found from the research was that the majority of universities, majority of boroughs have good links with universities, and they, especially when there are universities in their borough. And also universities can often be part of sort of much larger institutionalized anchor institutions groups, but also strategic partnerships in boroughs. But we also found that, universities like UCL very well networked across, across the boroughs, and have engagements with a number of boroughs around different initiatives. But also we found that sort of boroughs had also engaged with universities like Oxford and Cambridge, Plymouth. So there already are existing relationships in place. So just in terms of, there isn't a slide actually, but I just thought it'd be quite useful to sort of just do a quick readout of the outcomes of the borough workshop, because I think we asked some four very clear questions. The first one was looking at sort of practical short-term sort of priorities in terms of support, and potentially how we might all collaborate as collectively as councils and the GLA. And again, in terms of some of the responses, we thought the areas where people thought, we could collaborate on practical deliverables could be around support for data sharing, support for sort of pooling ideas around how you create sustainable boroughs. Again, there was interest in looking at where challenges could benefit from a sort of sub-regional or a London-wide sort of collaborative approach. And then obviously there was real interest, I think, probably as one of the first steps in just stakeholder mapping, so understanding, where the research expertise lies, which departments, which academics, so that we can actually facilitate that brokerage. We asked boroughs about their sort of 2 to 3 sort of short-term policy or research questions, the sort of things that where we could add value. And a couple of those included sort of looking at, obviously, as you'd expect, long-term socioeconomic impacts of COVID, the sorts of things where initiatives which have were established during COVID, and looking at whether they're going to be long-term, whether things like hybrid working, and home working, the extent to which that will continue, changes in the use of public sector transport, for example, and what the implications of that might be. Again, obviously, concentrating many minds at the moment is this cost of living crisis, and just different policy responses to that, and have we actually, have we thought of all the different ways in which we can support Londoners through this crisis? And then again, I think one of colleagues mentioned, which we all have, I think, had to do over the last 2 years, is about sort of getting more agile at working in a sort of constantly changing sort of policy climate. And then just switching to long-term strategic challenges, we were asking boroughs to look at over the next 5 to 10 years about some of the areas where they thought policy innovation could work best. And again, what we sort of saw there, again, just a selection, because it was actually a really rich discussion. People thought that there was some appetite for tackling, sort of looking at best practice approaches to tackling debt and financial precarity, looking at new models of finance and investment, looking at digital inclusion. And then finally, we asked about sort of, are there any other sort of longer term strategic issues that aren't covered by the other questions, where again, potentially we could work together, and where there were gaps. And in that category, people were really interested in looking at sort of cross-sector working around sort of, for example, around net zero and health, or active travel and economy. So looking at how those two policy agendas sort of interact. Again, there was a sort of suggestion that LRAP could play a role in sort of convening broader stakeholder discussions and stakeholder partnerships. And then there's an interest in sort of citizens engagement, among others, and we're happy to sort of share the outcomes of that research if people are interested. But I think it was just, it was able to demonstrate that there is actually a whole range of areas in which we think that the partnership could add value and practical value. And so over the next sort of few weeks, we'll be looking at how we sort of organise that, and particularly with the policy fellows on board. And then finally, next slide, just to talk about next steps. So as I say, the policy fellows will be appointed in a couple of weeks. We have the LRAP board, which meets 3 times a year. It will next convene in May, and then a lot of work will go on from the appointment of the policy fellows, looking at what's the best platform for developing brokerage. And then we've got a joint event with the International Public Policy Observatory at UCL, looking at different international cities, lessons and experiences of sort of COVID responses and recovery, and that'll be at the beginning of June. So I think that's where I finished. Obviously, we've got all of the Twitter handles and various websites, etc. And then we'll hand over to Amy now, who will just talk about examples of different academic and policy partnerships.
Thanks so much, Michelle. Ben, are you able to share the slides for me? Yeah, I'm sure it's coming. So yes. Thank you so much. I'm Amy Lightstone. I'm Head of Engagement and Operations for London at UCL in our Pro Provost London office. And I essentially head up UCL's Strategic London Framework, which is how, where and why we engage in London, and particularly working with our strategic London partners to develop our relationships. And I also sit on the LRAP forum, which Ben mentioned earlier. So I'm able to broker UCL's academic connections to the forum and to other members through that vehicle. And Ben's just asked me to share a couple of examples of UCL's academic and local government partnerships and projects, and given my role, I thought I'd share a few of those which are in London. And also just to say that we very much value the relationships we have with local authorities, and given the size of UCL, part of my job is to understand who we're working with and utilise our London office as a platform for these type of partnerships. And whilst we are based in Bloomsbury in Camden, as Michelle alluded to, we obviously have strong links to Camden Council and to our other local partners, but our links don't stop in Camden. We're opening up a new campus on the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park this year in September, called UCL East. So we're developing our links with Newham Council and the other Olympic boroughs. And then we also work across all of London, and we have developed strong connections with a wide range of London local authorities. And also, I think it's important to note that we do have a dedicated public policy unit at UCL, and that sets out to support engagement between academic researchers and public policy professionals. So many of the examples I'll set out today, but also a lot of the work at UCL is led by public policy. So on this slide, I've just set out how we engage in academic policy projects and initiatives, but I'll just start with talking about public policy, seeing as I just mentioned them. So they've been working with Waltham Forest, particularly on their State of the Borough report, and they sit on the advisory board, which means they've been successful in engaging academics directly in the work, and they've got a good vehicle directly into the borough. And they've been focusing on the EDI approach to delivery mechanisms, and that's been quite successful in that example. And they've also been working with Camden Council in collaboration with my London office, where they developed a summer school and internship programme for students in collaboration with the University of Manchester. And that was over 7 weeks, and it's happened 2 years in a row, and something that we'd like to continue. And actually, that's been really useful because they've had students from different disciplines undertake policy internships, and it's the students have learned so much, but obviously the exec at Camden have also benefited from the relationship, and a couple of the students have actually gone on to be employed by Camden in their policy design team. So that's been quite successful and something we are looking to continue. Also, we have a memorandum of understanding with Camden Council, so we have a strategic partnership with them, and we've set out this academic policy engagement as part of that MOU. So we're quite committed to developing ways of working together, and we talk about this quite regularly with Camden, and it's something that they're interested in as well. Another example is CAPE. So I know we've talked about CAPE already. It's the Capabilities in Academic Policy Engagement Initiative. So it's UCL is the London partner, but there's 5 universities in total, and they've been working with Islington Council, looking at the Good Work agenda. And again, they've delivered roundtables. They've had some advisory board commitments, and they've been able to provide academic evidence to support their work, and that's continuing. And this is quite a good example of how we work with the local authorities at quite a high level, and it means that we can bring in the right academics from UCL. Obviously, UCL is vast, and it's important to get the right people on these boards. So that's something that my office can help broker. And then we've also brokered some connections with Hackney Council and Harrow Council through the London Council's climate programme. So that was seeking to engage academics in policy work relating to climate and net zero. And that was in collaboration with London Higher. And this is a long-term initiative. It's until 2030. So we were really pleased to be able to get 2 academics on those boards, because there's 8 years left of the programme, and I know they'll review after a couple of years. But we always like these long-term initiatives, because we can demonstrate over time how we're collaborating and having a partnership which is mutually beneficial to both parties. So that's a really good example. And then most recently, we worked with Newham Council and our UCL East site, and with Noel, who's organised today. So we've had 8 academics contribute to a citizen assembly on 15-minute neighbourhoods. So those academics actually led a roundtable. We produced video materials, and then those were shared with citizens in Newham ahead of their consultation. And that's been a really useful process as well, because we've managed to bring together academics from a range of disciplines, and also exec from Newham Council from a range of disciplines to work together. And that's something that we'd like to continue as we develop our relationship with Newham. And then just on to the next slide, please, Ben. I'll just talk a little bit about CAPE. I know we've mentioned it already, but they, as the London partner, UCL and CAPE, they're supporting both London and regional academic policy engagement, and it's through 2 types of fellowship schemes. And the overarching aim of this is to support the development of soft infrastructure. And I just wanted to talk about the Inward Fellows, because they're not as widely known as the policy fellowships, but this is where a CAPE fellow spends the equivalent of 5 days meeting with academics at the 5 partner universities. Plus they have opportunities to co-design events and host academic placements, and apply for seed funding and a whole host of other things. But there's 20 of these fellows a year, and 2 of those in the current cohort are at local authorities, so at Waltham Forest and at Islington. And so we have that sort of direct link into the local authority at that level. And then CAPE are just about to announce their next cohort, and that will also have local authority colleagues within that cohort. So that's something that we're really keen to continue, because it just demonstrates the importance of the connection and the value of the connection between local authorities and universities. And then there's the policy fellowships, like Michelle outlined. So starting within the next month, CAPE have this policy fellowship with the GLA, which aims to mobilise academic knowledge in London, and that's one of many fellowships. There's one with the University of Manchester and another with West Yorkshire. And then there's a policy fellowship with Newham Council as well. And that's aiming to improve participative policy making. And again, just demonstrating the importance of working with our local authorities in London. And that was it.
Great. That was a really thought-provoking and kind of powerful overview of like the existing infrastructure that exists and kind of the collaborations that Amy talked about, and also the future opportunities that the London Research and Policy Partnership are putting in place. And of course, we will send you slides so that you can digest that kind of more with your colleagues. But what we're going to do now is go into breakout rooms on a couple of areas on the kind of the what and the how. So got kind of one question, and I'll share these as we go into breakout rooms and on our online board, which is, what are kind of the key research areas that you think would be most important for policymakers and academics to collaborate on? Michelle shared some insights from the Borough workshop that took place on some of those areas that came through. You might want to reinforce those were the important ones, or there might be ones that you think are really important that are missing. And then the second is more on the how, which is, what are the key principles for this collaboration, which would really help you in terms of how the partnership kind of evolves and develops in the future. And so hopefully, if the tech works, then we will be able to go into breakout rooms and kind of have a chat. What I would suggest, we're going to have between now and 5:02. And what I would suggest is, as you go into your breakout rooms, let's have a kind of 5 minutes silent brainstorming on maybe at least kind of the first of those questions, which you'll see is on the Jamboard. So you can start kind of jotting down kind of thoughts and priorities, and then kind of discuss that with other people in the breakout rooms. And I think we've got a really diverse set of people here from kind of different roles, different kind of backgrounds, different organisations, as well. So really looking forward to your ideas and thoughts, and then we'll come back into the main room at 5:02 to share next steps. So in a very short moment, I will let you all into your breakout rooms. So hopefully you should all be going off. And at this point, I'm going to stop recording.